All right.
Okay, so welcome everyone to Anglo Nation South Asia. So happy that everyone's here. They could make time in this chaotic weekend because, like I said earlier, it's either this month is either hectic because of the holiday season or it's hectic because of all the work that you have to do before the year ends and all those deadlines. But Uh, this is also going to be our last meetup for this year. So thank you, Chandler. This makes it extra special that you're doing it. It's just to promote mental health and everyone taking time off and not having the desire to be in front of the screens all the time. It's a struggle in this day and age, but I'm sure we can manage. Just yeah, we'll see each other next year, but we'll be around. Everyone's always around in England, South Asia. The channel's there, and this will also give everyone the time to revisit some of the wonderful videos that wonderful meetups that we've had, and we have all those recordings on YouTube in our YouTube channel. So I strongly encourage people who have skipped some of those to go through them at their own pace, at their own time, and enjoy all the beautifulness that we had this year with our awesome, awesome speakers. And before I hand it over to Chandler, I just also wanted to mention that we have Alec Castillo, if I'm saying his last name right, coming to Anglo Americas this Friday. And that's pretty exciting. And we also have the AG Grid team coming up soon, and the that meet and greet with AG Grid is gonna be free. So definitely look forward to that. Add to that to your calendar, and yeah. Now take it away, Chandler. The floor is
Awesome.
all yours.
Thank you so much, Ankita.
Hmm.
Thanks everybody for coming. I hope y'all should be able to see my screen. But today I want to talk about um, material dialogues and their life cycles and how breaking them up into events that happen and moving it into the NGRX effect model helped make my components a little bit more pure, a little bit easier to test. So first off, a little bit about me.
Wait, hang on, Chandler. I just sorry to interrupt you, but I just also quickly want to emphasize that we all of us can agree that the stock is very specific to material and NGRX, and there's no way that either of us are recommending that to use material dialogue you have to use NGRX. That's not the case. This is just only purely about how it's the power of NGRFX and material dialogue. It's easier to combine them, and just for the ease of the flow of NGRX and to test your components, but it no way means to promote that use NGRX. It's not a promotion of NGRX. It's whatever state management is right for you, whether it's NGRX or it's not. But if you are using material dialogue, it's helpful to know how, and you're using NGRX, it's helpful to know how you can use them.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's a great point.
sorry to interrupt, Chandler. I
No,
just don't
no,
want
no.
people to think that by just because we have the stock, we're like use NGRX and use material and everything else is crap. Because when you start thinking like that, you're restricting yourself on understanding what works best for your framework for your application, and you're just focusing on that one particular solution that's being presented. But that's definitely not the case here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And, honestly, I may not have done a great job in the past when talking about this of promoting that, you don't have to use NGRX. You don't even have to use material dialogue. There's other great UI frameworks out there that do modals and dialogues. But this whole talk, and I wrote a blog post before this, but this all kind of came from my experience. How the native um, the native implementation of material dialogue, my use case was getting a little bit too complex to go to using that. So I started exploring other options, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, a little bit about me. My name's Chandler. I am a senior UI engineer, and I spend a lot of my time working with Angular and Ngrx. Um, so yeah, talking about the typical dialogue lifecycle. Typically, not always, but typically, um, in our component, we'll have a click handler, and then we'll have probably in that component, probably somewhere in that method or somewhere in that component, we'll have our config data. So this would be whatever we want to give our dialog. And then we'll say dialog open, that returns our dialog ref. And then we'll give it our component that we want to open, and then we'll give it that config data. That dialog ref has a method on there called after closed. When you call that method, it returns an observable that we subscribe to, and then we do whatever we want to with that data. That's returned from the dialog itself. Most of the time, what happens downstream is we make some sort of HTTP call eventually. And then in our dialog component, we inject our mat dialog data injection token so we can get that dialog that was passed from the host component. And then in our save method, or if you're not using the save method or in using one of the directives, we just close it, passing back whatever we want to pass back to that app component. So this is pretty typical. This is also a contrived example. Sometimes it's not as simple as closing the dialog, getting the data back, and then making that HTTP call or doing whatever we want with that data. And this is where my use case was a little bit more complex. And this is when I started realizing, like, hey, this is getting a little clunky, and this doesn't feel as ergonomic as it could be. If your use case is simple, this works fine. This is pretty straightforward. But a couple of problems that I saw, and I did a little Excalibur about this, was that usually in our host component, we have one method that handles the whole entire life cycle. So that's opening, closing, dealing with the data that's returned from that. So we can get a lot of arrows going in different places. So like we got an arrow from the host component going to the dialog. Um, Oops, sorry, this is actually this is the wrong one. Um, this is an example of what it looks like with effects. Um, but anyways, there's lots of arrows and directions. And like I was saying, your host component is going to have one method that handles the whole life cycle. So when you go to unit test that method on that component, it can be a little complicated. Also, testing that dialog component could be a little bit more simpler. Um, and we usually have to mock multiple things to test that component. So if we move it into the effect model, what could that look like? So in our host component, we'll open our dialog. So we might dispatch an action, and the effects class handles the whole life cycle. So we'll have an open dialog, a save dialog, and a close dialog. So when we open it, we're going to go into effects. We're going to open the dialog. That opens our dialog, right? And then the dialog is going to save. So that jumps back into the effect model to run that save dialog effect. And then usually in that save dialog effect, we're probably going to make an HTTP request. So we can go ahead and do that there, or we can return another action and do that in a separate observable. And then we'll save, get it back, and then we'll close. So if we start modeling that and we start thinking about the life cycle of a material dialog, um, the first place I start, and the first place I start usually if I'm doing anything in NGRX is I always start with the actions. So we're going to have a dialog opened, a dialog saved, and a dialog closed. When we open the dialog, we know that we're going to pass in a component. Now, typing components can be a little weird, and this was one of the first drawbacks I started to see. Uh, so you can type it as unknown. The Angular CDK exposes a type called component type, so that's what I would suggest is use the component type, and then it's a generic takes a generic type and then pass unknown into that. And then our saved action, we're going to need data to save. And then our dialog closed, we might have data for close. We might have a success message, or we might not have anything. So it just kind of depends on your use case and how you want to handle that. So now we have our actions. Let's look at our effects for that. So notice I have 4 effects. So 3 of them model the material dialog lifecycle. So we have open, saved, and closed, but I also have a save data success. And this one's really important because when we make that HTTP call, we don't want to close that dialog unless it's a successful um, uh, request. If you're doing a pessimistic update, now if you're doing optimistic updates, you could go ahead and close it and then reopen it. But that could get tricky, and I think typically when you're opening a dialog and and the user's making some kind of change that needs to be persisted back to the back end, you'll probably want to stick with a pessimistic update anyways. So starting with the dialog open, we listen for that type, that action that's dispatched, and then we just simply tap off of it and then we open the dialog. So we inject, um, I don't have that example here. I don't have that in the code here, but you'll want to inject your dialog service into this class. And then most importantly, you'll notice in this, we're not returning any action. So we'll want to make sure that we dispatch false on that. Now, if you don't do that, what will happen is the NGRX infrastructure will just keep on looping through that one, and you'll be stuck in an infinite loop, and it's not fun. So after that dialog's open, we do some work, we save. In that dialog component, we're going to dispatch our saved action, and then our effect picks that up. And then we just return our save. And then, so that'll trigger more likely another effect somewhere that'll actually make that HTTP request. And then it'll either trigger a success or a error action. So that is where I have that effect that listens for that success action. And then it just takes that response and then closes the dialog. And then the dialog picks that up, actually closes the dialog. So it calls close all from the dialog ref. And then here we can either return, a snack bar, or you might have a banner, or you might not do anything. And in that case of not doing anything, you would of course want to put a dispatch false on there as well. So now that we've moved that, what does testing kind of look like? So testing effects is pretty straightforward. So you have your actions. You set your actions to an observable of that action, right? You subscribe, and then you expect your expectations. You make your assertions there. So testing effects is pretty straightforward. Testing the dialog component becomes pretty straightforward as well. So the only thing we want to mock is the NGRX store. So we use provide mock store from NGRX. And then we make our assertions. So like if we were unit testing our save method, so we would want to assert that when you click on the save button, it dispatches the appropriate actions with the appropriate data. So what this kind of does for you when you move it to the effect model is it makes the barrier of entry for component testing a lot lower, especially in the host component, because your open method, your click handler that starts everything, uh, ends up just dispatching an action. You don't have to worry about opening the dialog, getting the dialog ref back, listening for the after closed observable. You're just dispatching an action. Um, Effects are super powerful. They're really composable, so that can really allow us to build more complicated features. They're easy to test. And for me, this is kind of subjective, but for me, breaking up the life cycle into a series of events was easier for me to grok, and it was easier for me to kind of track down and debug when problems were happening, especially using the dev tools. So when you're working with effects, you want to make sure you're adhering to some best practices. So I kind of grabbed these from an episode of the Angular show where Mike Ryan was talking about this. But you want to make sure you're using the correct higher order mapping operator, and that's mostly when you're dealing with HTTP requests. So switch map for reads, concat map for writes. If you're unsure of what the best operator to use, the safest one is concat map. But the drawback is there could be back pressure. If you're going to be handling store information, you want to make sure you're using concat latest from, because it handles your selectors in a more intelligent way and only computes them if that effect is running. And then you want to make sure you're composing your effects and have many small effects. So typically, you may want to have one effect that listens to one action, and then compose them as needed. So yeah, here's a couple of links. I wrote a blog post about this on dev.to. For this is Angular. I created a small little repo that I'll demo here in a second, and then also put the link to the slides. So if you don't care, Ankita, I'll go ahead and demo real quick.
Go for it.
All right, we will see Inception. Hold on one second. All right, so this is probably the worst UI ever, but it works, right? How many times do we ship that? It works. So in this, we have our list of users and their contacts. So we might want to edit a contact. So we click our edit button, and let's say her last name's not Graham anymore. Let's say it's Smith. And then we want to save it. We'll persist that to the back end. And then, of course, we want to maintain our state on the front end. So pretty simple app, right? So what does the code for this look like? Let's see. All right, can you still see my screen?
Can now.
Yes.
Awesome. So what does the code for that look like? So super simple. In our app component, we're just grabbing our users from the store, and then on initialization of the component, we're calling fetch users, and then on edit button, this is where we open our dialog. So we dispatch a open dialog, passing in the component that we want. So if we look at
Hey,
our
Chandler, can you zoom in a bit or increase the font size?
let's see.
Control plus.
Too much? Just enough. How's that look? Is that better?
Yeah. You can
Okay.
also minimize the exploder.
How about that?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so back on the onEdit method, that's our click handler. This is where we dispatch that action to open the dialog. and then it takes in the component that we want to dispatch, and then of course some data. So if we go and look at our effects for that, I have an open dialog effect right here that listens for that, and then it just opens the dialog, that the dialog service from material, and then of course we have to dispatch false. So that opens our dialog. So looking in our dialog, pretty straightforward. So we get that data and we pull it off of the injection token. We inject our store, and then I create a new form group using that data, so we can display their current value. And then when we make some changes and then we want to save, we call on edit as our click handler. And what this does is dispatch the user actions.save dialog, passing in our user, our original user, and then our changes that we made. So if we look at that effect, our edit user effect, or our save dialog effect, excuse me. If we look at our save dialog effect, so we're listening for that, and then we take those changes, and then we create a new user, and then we return that action called edit user, passing in our new user, our edited user. So that brings us to right here. We listen for the edit user effect or action. Using concat map, we get the user, and then we call our user service edit user. We pipe off of that, and then we receive our user as a success. I didn't handle any errors here. I should have, but I didn't. We get that successful response back, and then we call edit user success. Now, edit user success, the only thing it does is it just listens for that action to fire, and then it returns our close dialog action with a success message. And then our close dialog method closes our dialog right here. And then of course we dispatch. We want to make sure that we're not dispatching any actions out of here, so we dispatch false. And then we call this.dialog.close all. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. Breaking them up into composable effects that all listen to one action. And then, you can compose some really crazy things with Ngrx effects. It's a super powerful side effect model. You can do a lot of things. And for me, it helped grok what was all happening. I got the Redux dev tools kind of in my back pocket to help me debug. And then, like I said, testing became pretty straightforward, because if we were to test this on edit method, we would just make our assertion that our save dialog action was fired with this data or whatever data we would assert. And then of course the click handler and the host component to open it, it becomes straightforward as well. We just assert that dispatch was called with the proper parameters. So yeah, that's all I got.
Nice. All right. Don't really see any questions. You can use tab still. But did anyone have any questions? Doesn't look like it. Do you have a link for your slides and your demo app for us?
Yeah, let me.
You can post it in the chat here, and I'll save it.
Get that real quick. In the slides, there's a demo. In the slides at the last slide has has links to the GitHub repo, the dev.to post, and then it has a link for the slide as well. So I'll post that in this chat. I
Okay.
see one question on there. What's back pressure?
Oh, I
So
see that. Yeah.
So the way I understand back pressure, and this applies with concat map, but so so say you're in a post office. This is how Mike Ryan described it. So say you're in a post office, and you go up to the desk and you want to ship a package, but your package is super complicated. And it's going to take a while, right? So with concat map, the way that operator works is um, it takes care of that. It would take care of that one person and then move on to the next person after that one's done, right? So it would do it in order, right? And this is why you want to do it for writes back to your API, because you want to make sure everything is in order, um, and you want to make sure none of your API calls are getting lost. So like with switch map, what would happen is say I'm at the counter and Kita walks in, she's just going to push me out of the way and say, hey, my package is more important, right? So it switches, right? With concat map, back pressure would be a line starts to form out of the post office itself. Um, at least that's how I understand it. I may be wrong there, but
That's a good analogy. That's a good way of explaining it. I hope that makes sense.
Yep. And now Simon has a question.
and what Grok is? So Grok is just understanding, like being able to wrap your mind around something. I hope that makes sense. Um, does our team mostly use Ngrx and Angular? Yes, we use Ngrx. We use store, feature store, component store, and then yeah, we use material design in Angular. We love it all. Yeah, and one thing I've wondered though is since effects are so powerful, with power comes great responsibility, right? So I've always wondered what's that line where I start abusing effects, and the kind of backstory of how this all happened. I was Tim DeStriver, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. He wrote an article about Ngrx effects. Start using effects for this, right? I think is what the article is titled, and that's where I got the idea. He had a small section about it, about using effects for dialogues and snack bars and other things like that. So that's where I got the inspiration from, and that's when I started really digging into it. And you know, I reached out to Tim and I reached out to some other people that are way smarter than me, just to make sure I wasn't abusing effects, because they are powerful, right? You can do some cool stuff with them, but you know, with that power comes great responsibility not to abuse them.
Yeah, and I think to that point, Chandler, I think one of the things, sort of like good rules to put in place so you don't abuse it, like that I found is like if you use unique actions for like all this events in your system and your effects only dispatch, like they only have one responsibility and you each effect just dispatches one action. Like I really, if you use that model, then every event in your system can be, time traveled and debugged in the Redux dev tool. So, really any kind of problems that people worry about can be easily like debugged because everything is mapped to like a unique instance. The problem is like a lot of times people will create like a generic action that's like, dispatch this dialogue, but maybe you have 50 different dialogues, or maybe dialogue isn't necessarily a good example, but it could be like get data or something like super generic. And then it's like you could have, you enter a route and you could have that action being dispatched from a guard. It could be a component, could be a service, could be an effect. And so that's where it gets tricky to sort of backtrace and determine, okay, like where did where did this come from? And that's where effects can, it's not really, in my opinion, a side effect of effects. It's more a side effect of like bad architecture as a whole. And actions really are the, I think at the end of the day in Ngrx, like actions are what make and break you. And so like if you don't do those right, then you're going to feel the pains of other things in Ngrx in your application.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Naming your actions appropriately, not as commands, but as events, right? Good, adhering to good action hygiene. A lot of people talk about it, but yeah, actions are really the cornerstone of Ngrx. They are the talkers, right? Like if you think about Ngrx in like a messaging sense, reducers listen. They listen for actions. Actions are the talkers, right? So they speak. Reducers listen, but effects are pretty cool because they can both listen and talk. So they can listen to effects and then they can, listen to actions and then they can spit out actions. So that's what makes the effect model like super powerful. But yeah, actions are the cornerstone of Ngrx, and that's why I always try to start first with actions because it kind of helps me model how things are going to happen.
Correct. And if you do another like similar term is like event storming, it's basically like if you're like working on a new feature or like even a new app, it's like it's great to start with like what are the things a user is going to do or the system's going to do, and then basically like literally logging out all those events, and then ultimately those become actions in your system.
Yep, that's right. One question: would you suggest adding Ngrx if we do not have that already? If we want to use the advantages of using Ngrx effects, so just to be clear, Ngrx is a suite of libraries, right? So you have store, you have component store, you have effects. You would, if you wanted to take advantage of using effects, you would also need to add the store as well. Because with a store, you would be able to dispatch your actions, you'd have your selectors, and then you would add effects as like a separate package. So I don't know if I would. It really just depends on your app, right? And it also depends on your state, because you may not need the global store if you're not dealing with global state. If you're dealing with local state, I would suggest component store, and it has effects, although a little different. It has kind of an effect model as well, and I've been toying with the idea of moving this to component store just to see what it kind of looks like, but it would be super straightforward as well. I don't know if I would suggest it. It really just depends. It really depends on your specific use case, what your application looks like.
Yeah, it doesn't also have to be in Ngrx, just for state management purposes. There are other libraries, other lighter or simpler libraries that you could be using.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I preface this talk where like if you are already using Ngrx effects and you're already using material dialog, there's a great way you can combine those two to handle the life cycle of that dialog. And that's what Chandler presented, and it was really well done. But just to be, Ngrx effects is really powerful as long as you handle the beast well, like how Chandler said. It comes with great power comes with great responsibilities. I don't know if I would recommend it for any app without knowing anything about the app.
Yeah, definitely not without knowing anything about the app, or or like your team size. Like if you're a solo dev working on an application, I don't know if I would do Ngrx store. Personally, I like component store a lot, because I was always used to. So before I learned Ngrx, I was very like hesitant to learn it. because I made it so far without learning the Redux pattern, and I was like, oh, why do I need that? It just looks like a lot of code, and I can't see the benefit. But now, working in applications where states flying all over the place, and if there's a lot of people contributing, it makes makes things super easy. It makes a lot of sense, and the prescribed pattern is really great, especially in large teams. But I really liked component store because I was always used to rolling my own state with services and subjects, behavior subjects, replay subjects, and then yeah, just rolling my own class, making a service that extends that class, and basically what component store is today, right? I was already used to doing that.
Yeah, and like to your point, Chandler, you also still don't need component store for simpler state management. Like Deborah Kurata has a lot of courses, a lot of talks out there that just use a behavior subject as an observable, and that just works absolutely fine, which is why there's no way of recommending one thing over the other, unless you know what I mean. It's just has to be a pros and cons decision that you will end up making.
Yeah, and you can like what Deborah teaches, she uses the scan operator a lot, and that is a great way to maintain, especially list state. And then, so there's a question: is there a way to do what you just displayed with effects with just using RxJs? So I'm sure there is, but what you would end up doing is writing the model similar. So like what Deborah teaches with scan, for example. So usually she'll have a behavior subject that she'll next a command into. So that command would be like add a product, edit product, or whatever. When you're nexting that command into the stream, that's basically the same thing as dispatching an action, right? And then she'll use the scan operator to help maintain that state. So I'm sure there is a way to do it. And my guesses would be you would have some kind of command structure with a behavior subject, and then somewhere in your pipe, when you're combining everything, you would just open and close based on that command that was nexted into that subject.
Yep. Was that all the questions? Let me go back real quick. Yeah, I think that was all the questions. I don't see any other. Great job, Chandler. Thanks. For
thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie, I was super nervous before.
I know, but you did great. So next time, if you try it with component store, definitely come back and tell us all about it.
Yeah, I really will. Yeah, I've been toying with the idea of what are ways to make this better, right? Like, what are ways we can reuse this, and what are ways just to improve the pattern. I think it's a great pattern. And from like research that I've done, it's being used a lot. It's just not a lot of people's talked about it. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity to write a blog post about it. So
yeah, I agree. It's a beast. Like Ngrx is a beast. So
yeah. And like Jordan said, there is some confusion around Ngrx, but if I'm not mistaken, Jordan, are you on the team? You're on the Ngrx core team, are you not?
I'm not on the team officially. I have contributed quite a bit though, so
gotcha.
I'm friends with all the core people, but
yeah. Well, I think you and the core team do a great job, especially explaining it and promoting it. And
thanks. Yeah, it's in my opinion, it's it can be a confusing like platform to like to use, but like once you get through, like once it clicks, like I think it really unlocks a really clean way of architecting applications that are like easy to maintain over time. And I think that that's the thing that, I don't know, that's why I really contributed to. I really like it. And when it's done right, it's beautiful, but it's like a lot of things. When it's not done right, it can become a mess, you know? And so that's where it's people like you to help educate the community. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Well, thanks again, Ankita. Thank you for all that attended. And yeah, you can find me on Twitter if you have any questions. My DMs are always open. Hit me up. The Angular community is great, though. So, I mean, I can't, like, the community is so great. You know, I wouldn't want to be like a single point of failure. So if I don't respond, you can probably literally ask anyone. But yeah, thanks again.
Okay, I'm not muted. Yeah, thanks so much, Chandler, once again. And thanks every one of you for taking out the time today and joining us and hanging out with us. And yeah, thanks, Sheldon, for supervising over this.
No, I wasn't supervising. I was just like, I was like, an Ngrx talk. I love Ngrx. Like, I just want to hear what people are saying. So he did a great job.
Always. So. And it's always great to have someone talk about an idea that isn't that common and to see other people's response to it. So this is something that we recently started implementing in our code base, and we have always been like, are we doing it right? But the more we have been adopting it, the more it has been making sense to us. And we've had a lot of discussions within our team about this exact pattern, and we've been like, okay, yeah, this definitely, like, we are not overcomplicating things, so it makes sense. And which is also why when Chandler had the discussion on this, we were like, yeah, we should definitely share it outside of our team and with the broader Angular community. And I immediately messaged him that you should definitely do a talk on Angular.
Yeah, and to that point, like this specific problem, I think is one a lot of people have, because the material dialogue is a little complex. Like if you're doing, like you said, like beyond just a basic like one modal here or there, but it's like and so like this is a great place. Like if you're having this problem and you're using material dialogue, and like this is a great place to start. And like if you're not using Ngrx even, or maybe you are but you're not solving this problem, like if you go about implementing your dialogues this way, it will, like, that process of learning that will probably open your eyes to like, oh, I could be doing this for maybe not quite as difficult of problems, but it could be like, oh, but if I did this, it could clean this up and maybe less dependencies and, you know, that kind of thing. So I think it's a good place to start for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I would strongly recommend everyone go through Chandler's app, the demo app that he shared with us, just to, even if you're not using Ngrx, but just to see like what the way that it's being used over here. I think it's really great. It's not that common, but it's really great.
Yeah, and if you're just learning Ngrx, the app's so small, right? And it does everything, in, you know, in a pretty prescribed way. So like it would be a great repo to learn from, especially like dispatching, reducing, and selecting. And hey, if you want to submit a PR to improve the styling, that would be great.
Add tailwind to it and be like, done.
Yeah, add tailwind, done.
Just kidding. Yeah, I mean, it serves its purpose for a simple, quick demo app. So yeah. All right. Yeah. So thanks once again. everyone. And I will see you next year, unless I see you in any of the other Angular meetups. But yeah, Angular Nation South Asia by itself, we will see y'all next year. So have a great rest of the year.
Bye,
Stay
everyone.
safe. Don't get murdered.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.